The Underground Railroad, America's Secret Network. Chapter 1: The Train with No Tracks. Part 1.1. The woman W.H. couldn't read, but couldn't be stopped. She was illiterate, epileptic, and barely 5 feet tall. Her hands were calloused, her back scarred from the lash, and her eyes burned with something most people couldn't name, but everyone could feel. Her name was Harriet Tubman, but forget everything you thought you knew, because the woman history books have reduced to a few textbook lines was far more than a conductor on a secret railroad. She was, in the words of one Union general, a one-woman army moving behind enemy lines. What kind of network let someone with no maps, no weapons, no allies, no name, even lead over 300 people across enemy territory, through swamps, forests, towns, rivers, guarded borders, and never lose a single passenger? To understand Harriet Tubman, you have to understand the war she was fighting, not just against slavery, but against a system designed to erase people like her entirely. Born Araminta Ross around 1822, on a Maryland plantation, she wasn't even given a birthday. Just a brutal start. Like most enslaved children, she learned work before she learned words. As a child, she was hired out to white households, where she was beaten for every minor infraction, for wetting the bed, for crying, for not cleaning fast enough. At 12, her life almost ended. A fellow slave was caught trying to escape. A white overseer hurled a 2-pound iron weight at him. It missed. It hit Harriet in the skull. She collapsed, bled, slipped into a coma. She was never the same. From that day forward, Harriet suffered what she called visions, sudden blackouts, intense dreams, moments when she claimed to hear the voice of God. Modern medicine would call them seizures, likely epilepsy, but Harriet saw them as divine signals, markers, instructions, and that's where the myths could end. A disabled, scarred woman in the shadows of a violent world. But she did something astonishing. She got back up. In 1849, after years of enslavement, of losing family members to auctions, of living under a system that told her she was property, Harriet ran. Alone, with no guide, no compass, she crossed over 90 miles of hostile territory to reach Pennsylvania. A free state, but freedom, it turned out, was not the end of her story. It was the beginning. Most runaways vanished into new lives, changed names, hid from the past. Not Harriet. Within a year, she went back, then again, and again, 19 times in all. Each time, she led more people. Some were family, some were strangers, all were hunted. Think about that. The most wanted woman in the American South had no maps, no formal education, no backup plan, but she outmaneuvered slave catchers, patrolling militias, and one of the most brutal legal systems in U.S. history. She moved people at night, navigating by stars and trees. She disguised herself as a field hand, a laundry woman, a grieving mourner. She carried opium to quiet crying babies, and a pistol to threaten anyone who thought of turning back. You go on or you die, she told one frightened man. There was no room for fear, not with slave patrols only miles away. The Underground Railroad wasn't a train, and Harriet Tubman wasn't just a conductor. She was an engineer. She built the tracks. But here's the twist no one tells you in school. Harriet wasn't alone. What she was part of, what she carried inside her, wasn't just bravery. It was something older, something bigger. It was a network of ghosts, codes, firelight, and whispers, of hymns sung with double meanings, of stars that pointed north, of churches with hidden cellars and safe houses marked by lanterns in the window. She wasn't leading people across land. She was leading them through myth, through legend, through a secret America buried beneath the one we were taught. And as we begin this story, asterisks really begin it. We're not just talking about Tubman. We're talking about the shadows behind her, the roots etched into memory, the passwords passed through song, the white Quaker woman who opened her attic, the free black farmer who risked his land, the child who knew to knock 3 times on the back door. This is the story of America's secret network. The one built not with steel, but with soul. This is MetaFacts Legends. And what you're about to hear might just rewrite everything you thought you knew about freedom. Stay with us. Part 1.2 continues. A train without tracks. A war without guns. If you've never heard history told like this, subscribe to MetaFacts Legends. We uncover the stories your textbooks skipped. And don't forget to check the description below for exclusive resources and hidden gems on this chapter of history. Part 1.2. A train without tracks. A war without guns. There were no tunnels, no engines, no steel rails. And yet, the Underground Railroad moved faster than the law. The name was a lie, but a brilliant one. There was no train, there were no timetables, no steel tracks slicing through the South. But the metaphor caught on because it felt true, and it spread like wildfire. It whispered of movement, of speed, of destination. It made freedom feel mechanical, unstoppable, inevitable. But behind the metaphor was something even more powerful than a locomotive, a living, breathing, decentralized, underground intelligence network. A machine of people, not pistons. A system of symbols, not schedules. A war of whispers. And if you're imagining an underground spy ring, you're not far off. Picture this. It's 1850. You're an enslaved man named Elijah. You fled a plantation in Georgia. Barefoot, with nothing but a torn sack and a bruised rib. You're hungry, you're hunted. But then, in the middle of the night, you see it, a candle in the window. 3 stones stacked in a triangle by the fence. A pattern you were told to look for. That's a station. You knock twice, then once. A coded knock. A man opens the door. White, bearded, Quaker, silent. He feeds you cornbread, hands you a ragged coat. You sleep in his hayloft. At dawn, you're led through the woods by a teenage girl. She doesn't say a word, but she hums a song. Wade in the water. You were told, if you ever heard that, you're being watched, someone's guiding you. That's your conductor. And you're a passenger on the most dangerous journey of your life. Each night, you move 40 miles, 50, no map, just stars and the next code. You cross 5 states. You meet 6 conductors. You never know their names. They never know yours. That's the point. You're not running, you're riding. You're on the Underground Railroad. And what makes it beautiful and terrifying is this. There was no central leadership. No HQ, no master plan. It wasn't a railroad. It was a rebellion disguised as rumor. A whispered war without bullets. One abolitionist said it best. The Underground Railroad was like fog. You can't map fog, but it moves. It covers. It gets people out. So, who built this network? The answer might surprise you. Some were former slaves, like Harriet Tubman, who navigated escape routes by memory. Some were free black men and women who risked everything to house fugitives in attics and cellars. Others were white allies, Quakers, Methodists, Unitarians, religious rebels who believed conscience mattered more than country. And it wasn't just idealism. It was strategy. Maps weren't drawn, they were sung. Routes weren't printed, they were stitched into quilts. Each triangle or star a message. A road, a warning. Imagine trying to stop something like that. You couldn't. Southern slaveholders couldn't. Congress couldn't, even with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made it legal to arrest and return escaped slaves even in free states. The railroad kept rolling. Why? Because this wasn't a train. It was a movement powered by faith, memory, and fire. And the only thing this train burned was courage. Let's pause here, because this is the moment where most people ask, how did it even work? Without maps, without phones, without any written records, the answer, trust, not the warm, fuzzy kind, the high stakes, eyes locked, if you betray me we die kind. Everyone involved knew the cost. Conductors could be fined, imprisoned, lynched. Passengers faced capture, torture, re-enslavement, or worse. And yet, they still ran the line. Night after night, some stations were known only by word of mouth. Look for the red curtain in the second window. Follow the creek until you see the burnt tree. Others were legendary. Levi Coffin's house in Ohio. He helped over 2,000 runaways. The Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia. The secret tunnels under the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. Still, there was no single map. Because if there had been, it would have been found, burned, destroyed. So the railroad evolved like a living thing. It shifted routes, changed passwords, responded to arrests, patrols, weather, rumors. One route would go quiet for months, then suddenly reactivate, like a sleeper cell or a heartbeat. And yes, if this all sounds like Cold War spycraft, encrypted codes, dead drops, safe houses, aliases, it's because it was. Just a century earlier, but agents of the Underground Railroad weren't trained operatives. They were farmers, preachers, sailors, barbers, shopkeepers, but they operated with discipline, secrecy, and an almost spiritual sense of mission. Harriet Tubman once said, "I never run my train off the track. I never lost a passenger." That wasn't bravado, that was precision. She used owl calls to signal her presence, sang gospel songs as encrypted messages, even altered her routes constantly so no one, not even her own passengers, knew exactly where she'd lead next. And yet, people followed her, into the night, into the woods, into the unknown, because the alternative was slavery. Now here's the part that might truly blow your mind. Historians estimate the railroad helped tens of thousands of people escape, maybe even over 100,000 by some modern estimates. Though records are understandably scarce, and at its peak, especially in the 1850s, the railroad was operating in nearly every northern state, from Delaware and Pennsylvania all the way to Indiana, Michigan, and Canada. Yes, Canada, because even the so-called free states weren't safe after the Fugitive Slave Act. So many escapees went farther, north of north. Let's break it down with some numbers. By 1850, it's estimated that 1,000 slaves were escaping through the Underground Railroad every year. That's 20 per week, almost 3 every single day. At a time when the South's economy and identity was built on slavery. This wasn't just a humanitarian act. It was economic sabotage. Slaveholders were furious. They blamed abolitionists. They blamed the North. But mostly, they feared the idea that freedom could move without permission. And so, the railroad became more than just a threat. It became a myth, a ghost story told to children. A whisper passed in hushed voices at night. Don't you dare run. Some slave owners warned. That railroad doesn't exist. But it did. It just didn't leave tracks. Instead, it left legends, stories, and echoes. And it's in those echoes where we begin to see just how sophisticated and dangerous this invisible empire really was. Because it wasn't just about moving bodies, it was about moving information. When Harriet Tubman crossed into a new town, she often knew where the safe houses were before anyone told her. That meant word had traveled ahead of her, through couriers, through code, through community. One escaped slave described it like this: "I didn't walk into freedom. I was carried on the backs of ghosts. Ghosts who lived in attics, who left signs in windows, who spoke in songs and silences." So as we move deeper into this story, ask yourself, if a woman who can read could decode an entire continent, if farmers could outmaneuver bounty hunters, if songs could become roadmaps, what else don't we know? What else has been buried? Because the Underground Railroad isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a mirror, a riddle, a rebellion. And in the next chapter, we go even deeper into the land of darkness, where escape wasn't just dangerous, it was nearly impossible, and yet they ran. Coming up next, Part 1.3, America's Paradox, Land of the Free. Built on slavery, stay with us. Part 1.3, America's Paradox, Land of the Free. Built on slavery. It's the 4th of July, 1852. Fireworks explode across the sky. American flags wave from every storefront. Orators shout of liberty, justice, and the great promise of the United States. And in Rochester, New York, a black man named Frederick Douglass steps onto a stage. He looks at the crowd and says this: "What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim." The applause is awkward, scattered, because Douglass wasn't just delivering a speech. He was exposing a paradox. The United States of America, the land that declared all men are created equal, was, by 1852, home to nearly 4 million enslaved people. That's 1 in 8 Americans living not as citizens, but as property, bought, sold, whipped, branded, bred, and the economy of the nation, especially the South, was built on it. Let's go back a bit to 1793. That year, a man named Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin, a device that could separate cotton fibers from seeds with unprecedented speed. Almost overnight, cotton became the dominant cash crop in the South, and with it, the demand for enslaved labor exploded. In 1790, there were around 700,000 enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, that number had swelled to over 3.9 million, all without a single slave legally imported after 1808, when the international slave trade was banned. So how did the numbers grow? Through birth, through forced breeding, through the systematic dehumanization of black bodies. 3 out of 4 black children born in the South during that time were born into slavery. That's not a metaphor, that's not poetic, that's census math. The plantation economy, especially in states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, relied on vast tracts of land worked by enslaved people to produce cotton for global markets. By 1860, the South was producing over 2/3 of the world's cotton, and nearly 60% of American exports were cotton-based. This wasn't a Southern problem. This was a national industry. Northern banks financed plantations. Northern textile mills turned raw cotton into cloth. Insurance companies wrote policies for enslaved bodies. Politicians in both parties, Whig and Democrat, argued over slavery not to end it, but to manage its expansion. Eric Foner, in Gateway to Freedom, puts it bluntly: the railroad arose in a nation where law protected the enslaver, not the enslaved. And that protection came with teeth. Under the Constitution, enslaved people were considered 3/5 of a person for representation, but 0/5 when it came to rights. If an enslaved person escaped to the North, the Fugitive Slave Clause in Article 4 required their return. In 1793, Congress passed the first Fugitive Slave Act, making it easier for slaveholders to reclaim escaped people, even from states that had abolished slavery. But by 1850, pro-slavery forces wanted more. That year, a second Fugitive Slave Act was passed. This one went further. It made it a federal crime to aid a runaway slave. It forced citizens, even in free states, to help capture them. It denied the accused the right to testify or have a jury trial. Judges were paid more if they ruled the accused was a fugitive. Freedom wasn't just fragile, it was illegal. And here's the twist: the South, with all its power, was terrified. Why? Because every slave who escaped was a symbol, a crack in the system, a reminder that even the most tightly chained society could unravel if enough people slipped through. They didn't fear the Underground Railroad because of the numbers, though the numbers were rising. They feared it because of what it represented: defiance, a parallel country operating in the shadows. A silent rebellion where enslaved people became agents of their own liberation, and white allies risked everything to help them. This was a country within a country, one that didn't print money or pass laws, but moved people like ideas, fast, fluid, unstoppable. To understand how radical that was, you have to understand just how totalizing slavery was in the South. On the largest plantations, hundreds of enslaved people worked from sunrise to nightfall. Cotton wasn't just a crop, it was a regime. The entire social structure of the South was built on it. Plantation owners were the ruling class. Below them were overseers, merchants, and poor whites who, while not enslavers, were invested in the system. Their identity was rooted in whiteness, because at least they weren't at the bottom. And at the bottom was everyone else. Black people, whether enslaved or free, were subjected to constant surveillance, harassment, and the looming threat of violence. Free black communities in the North weren't immune either. With the Fugitive Slave Act, even someone who had been free for years could be dragged back south on the word of a single white man. America, this land of liberty, was a place where freedom was a privilege reserved for the few. But this is where the paradox sharpens into something more sinister. Because while the South was enslaving millions, it was also draping itself in the language of freedom, states' rights, individual liberty, constitutional protection. Slaveholders argued that they were the true Americans, the ones defending property rights, economic independence, and the traditions of the founders. They compared themselves to the revolutionaries of 1776. In fact, when Southern states eventually seceded, they didn't call themselves rebels. They called themselves patriots. So yes, the story of America in the 1800s is not just about hypocrisy. It's about weaponized ideals, the very words that inspired enslaved people to run. Freedom, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, were being used to justify the system that bound them. Frederick Douglass saw this clearly. In that same speech in 1852, he asked, "Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice, embodied in that Declaration of Independence, extended to us?" He knew the answer. So did Harriet Tubman. So did every runaway. The Underground Railroad wasn't just a resistance to slavery. It was a resistance to a lie dressed in red, white, and blue. And the deeper you dig, the more twisted it gets. Because even abolitionists, those who fought to end slavery, weren't all champions of equality. Some believed black people should be freed, but shipped to Africa. Others opposed slavery not because it was cruel, but because they believed it corrupted white morality. Few believed in true racial equality. So when a runaway slave made it north, they weren't always welcomed. They were often denied jobs, housing, education. They were watched, suspected, marginalized. Freedom wasn't a finish line. It was another battlefield. And yet, they still ran. Because the alternative was a life in chains. Or worse, a life believing the lie that chains were natural. The Underground Railroad, then, was more than a secret system. It was a radical declaration that liberty didn't belong to governments, that rights didn't come from courts, that humanity wasn't something you earned, it was something you claimed. And for thousands of people, that claim began with a single step, one foot forward, one night into the unknown, one coded hymn echoing through the trees. Now, let's look closer at the people who made that step possible. Not the passengers, but the hidden hands who lit the lamps, whispered the warnings, and built the stations. Because the railroad wasn't just a metaphor, it was a machine, and every machine needs engineers. Next up, part 1.4, inside the network, codes, maps, songs, and secret safe houses. Stay with us. Part 1.4, Freedom or Death, Why They Ran. It happened in the summer of 1855. The heat clung to the skin like wet burlap. The slave market in New Orleans bustled with merchants, buyers, cotton speculators, and human beings priced by the pound. They came in wagons, in chains, in silence. A mother named Sarah stood beside her 3 children, ages 9, 6, and barely 2. They had survived the journey together, packed into the belly of a trader's cart for over a week. But now, on the auction block, there was no together left. One by one, her children were sold to different buyers. The eldest boy went first, taken by a sugar planter heading west. The girl next, bought by a man from Mobile who liked her calm manner. The toddler, her baby, was wrenched from her arms as she screamed, "Please let me hold him one last time." She never saw them again. That night, under the flicker of a gaslight, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't just going to run. She was going to escape, not from slavery, but toward something she couldn't quite name. Hope, grief, justice, maybe all three. And she wasn't alone, because for every story like Sarah's, of loss, separation, heartbreak, there were hundreds more. Families torn apart not by death, but by paperwork, contracts, market logic. Slavery didn't just chain bodies, it fractured souls. Here's the part history often glosses over. Escaping slavery was not an act of desperation. It was an act of clarity. Most enslaved people understood exactly how dangerous it was to run. They weren't naive. They had seen what happened to others, men hanged from trees, women dragged back in chains, children punished as examples. Estimates suggest that only about 1 in 5 escape attempts succeeded. That means 80% of those who tried were caught or died. So why run? William Still, the man who documented hundreds of escapees in his Underground Railroad records, wrote, "They ran not from life, but toward it." That's the twist. People didn't flee slavery because they couldn't endure it. They fled because they finally believed they shouldn't have to. They ran because they dreamed, because they loved, because they imagined a world their bodies had never touched but their souls already knew. Take Henry Bibb, for example, an enslaved man in Kentucky who once escaped, only to return, risking everything, to find his wife. He didn't make it, she had been sold. Again, still, he tried. Or Henry Box Brown, who mailed himself in a wooden crate from Virginia to Philadelphia. 30 inches wide, 23 inches high, no food, barely enough air, just determination. Then there's Ellen and William Craft, a married couple who staged one of the boldest escapes in American history. Ellen, light-skinned enough to pass as white, disguised herself as a disabled male planter. William played her servant. Together, they boarded trains, steamboats, and carriages, moving through the South in plain sight, straight into freedom. These were not reckless acts. These were rehearsed, calculated, defined declarations of personhood, and at the core of every escape wasn't just the desire to flee. It was the desire to reunite, to find lost husbands, to reclaim daughters, to stitch back together families shredded by bills of sale. In a society where enslaved people had no legal recognition of marriage, of parenthood, of lineage, escape was a way of writing their names back into history. And yet, the system was designed to erase them. Slaveholders branded fugitives as thieves, stealing themselves, as if a human being was a stolen chair. Southern newspapers ran ads offering bounties for runaway property, describing scars, skin tone, and eye color with clinical detachment. But to the people who ran, freedom wasn't abstract, it was vivid. Freedom looked like a mother holding her child without fear, like a man choosing where to walk, like sleep without the threat of being sold in the morning. The journey to that vision was brutal. Most escapees traveled at night, guided by starlight, hiding in swamps, forests, and abandoned cabins. They drank from muddy creeks, ate whatever they could scavenge. Some moved with help, many moved alone, and the psychological toll was just as punishing. You can never relax, never exhale. Every friendly face might be a trap. Every dog bark might mean patrols were close. Every footstep behind you might be the sound of chains catching up. Yet still, they ran. Because the alternative wasn't just continued labor. It was the crushing of everything that made life worth living. In one account, a woman named Rachel was caught and returned. Her owner made her watch as he sold her daughter. Rachel later slit her own wrists and bled out in a sugarcane field. Her name was never recorded in the property ledger, but her story traveled. It whispered through the quarters. It became a reason. Every escape was a rebellion, not just against the slave system, but against the lie that it was normal, natural, unchangeable. Freedom wasn't guaranteed, but it was imagined. And that imagination is what kept the Underground Railroad alive. It wasn't just a system of routes and safe houses. It was a culture, a rumor you could believe in, a hope you could hold on to, even as your wrists bled from shackles. Some called it foolish, others called it holy. Harriet Tubman called it necessary. When asked how she did it, how she made 13 trips back into the South, how she never lost a single passenger. She didn't talk about courage. She talked about clarity. I had reasoned this out in my mind. She said, there were two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I couldn't have one, I'd take the other. That logic, terrifying as it sounds, became a rallying cry for thousands. Even those who never made it out carried that fire. It burned in the stories told over campfires, in the songs whispered under breath, in the eyes of a mother rocking a child to sleep while staring at the northern stars. And if you think this is all too dramatic, too cinematic to be real, remember this. The United States government created laws to stop them. Entire state budgets funded slave patrols and bounty hunter networks. Politicians debated new penalties. Federal judges were bribed. Militia groups mobilized, all to stop a group of people walking barefoot through forests at night, armed with nothing but instinct and love. And still, they ran. Because in a nation built on bondage, escape wasn't madness. It was sanity. It was survival. It was the closest thing to justice that most would ever taste. And as these runaways moved north, mile by mile, heartbeat by heartbeat, they didn't just bring stories of pain. They brought stories of ingenuity, of hidden roots, of secret songs, of coded quilts and firelit signals. Which brings us to the next chapter in this journey. How exactly did they do it? What were the methods, the tricks, the tools? How did a system with no headquarters, no budget, and no formal leadership function like a well-oiled machine? Because the Underground Railroad wasn't just brave, it was brilliant. Next up, Part 1.5, William Still, the Underground Secret Archivist. Still with us, you're exactly the kind of curious mind we love. Drop a fire in the comments if you're enjoying these hidden stories of resistance. For more details, check the description below and dive deeper into the untold history. Part 1.5, William Still, the Underground Secret Archivist. Before Google, before databases, before civil rights documentaries and national memorials, there was a single black man in Philadelphia, sitting at a wooden desk with an inkwell and a purpose. His name was William Still. And without him, we might never have known half the stories of the Underground Railroad. Most people think of the railroaders movement, people fleeing, running, disappearing into freedom. But behind that movement was memory, fragile, vanishing memory. Most fugitives didn't leave letters. They didn't write journals. They didn't want their names in records, because names could be tracked, captured, used against them. But William Still saw something others didn't. He saw that the stories themselves were weapons. Weapons against erasure. Born in 1821 to formerly enslaved parents in New Jersey, William Still was the youngest of 18 children. His mother had escaped slavery not once, but twice. After being recaptured the first time, she made it north with 4 of her children, but had to leave 2 sons behind. She never saw them again. That haunted William. It shaped him. It taught him that in the war against slavery, every name mattered. By the 1850s, Still had moved to Philadelphia and become a clerk at the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. But he wasn't just filing papers. He was running operations, helping fugitives find food, shelter, new identities. He was a keynote in one of the most active branches of the Underground Railroad. And he started doing something no one else dared. He wrote it all down. Not in the newspapers, not in coded telegrams, but by hand, in notebooks he kept hidden in his office. Every person who came through, he interviewed. He recorded their names, where they came from, who had helped them, what dangers they'd survived. It was risky. If those notes were found, it wouldn't just incriminate him, it could destroy the entire network. But Still believed the risk was worth it, because if he didn't write these stories, who would? And so he became what history never asked for, but desperately needed: a librarian of freedom, a quiet scribe documenting one of the most radical resistance movements in American history. The most famous quote from his record says it all. Each name I wrote was another secret buried in the soil of this country. One of the names he wrote was Henry Box Brown, the man who shipped himself in a wooden crate to escape slavery. Still was there when the box was opened in Philadelphia, and Brown emerged. Dizzy but alive, William asked his name and carefully wrote it down. But then came a moment that shook Still to his core. In 1850, a man named Peter came through the office. Still took his statement as usual. "Where are you from? Who was your owner? What's your family's name?" Peter answered, and Still froze. Because Peter was his brother, one of the boys his mother had been forced to leave behind decades earlier. They embraced, cried, reclaimed a family that slavery had tried to erase. And from that moment forward, Still's mission became even more urgent. He wasn't just writing records, he was restoring bloodlines. His notebooks, preserved against all odds, eventually became a book, The Underground Railroad Records, published in 1872. In it were over 600 names and stories, not all with happy endings, but all real, all raw, all defined. That book, ignored by scholars for nearly a century, is now one of the most important first-hand archives of resistance in the pre-Civil War United States. Still gave the voiceless a voice, not through speeches, but through ink, through careful, patient documentation, and in doing so, he helped prove something the South had tried desperately to deny: that enslaved people were not passive. They were not helpless, they were agents of their own liberation. Still's records showed intelligence, planning, strategy, names like Harriet Tubman, of course, but also names we've never heard: Clarissa Davis, Benjamin Johnson, Martha Griffith. Each name, once whispered in fear, now carved in history. It's tempting to see Still as just an archivist, a background figure, but that's the cinematic twist. He wasn't background, he was a guardian. He guarded the truth from being forgotten. He knew that without names, freedom stories would become legends, and legends could be dismissed. But with names, real names, the story becomes undeniable. In the Great War for Memory, William Still was a general with a pen. And if you're wondering why we're telling his story now, over 150 years later, it's because his mission isn't over. That's why we do what we do at MetaFacts, to bring back the buried names that built history. Because history isn't just made by presidents and generals. It's made by the ones who risked everything and then vanished into silence. Still refused to let that silence win. And neither do we. So next time someone tells you the Underground Railroad was just Harriet Tubman, remember, behind every conductor was a record keeper, a chronicler, a witness, and his name was William Still. Now, as we turn the page, we widen the lens, because Tubman and Still weren't operating alone. They were part of something much bigger, a network stretching from Georgia to Canada, across swamps, cities, and borders. Not just one woman, not just one archivist, but a ghost network, alive, pulsing, spreading. Coming up next, part 1.6, Not Just One Woman, the Ghost Network Spreads. Stay with us. Part 1.6, Not Just One Woman, the Ghost Network Spreads. By now, we know her name, Harriet Tubman, the conductor, the symbol, the legend. But here's the twist. She wasn't the Underground Railroad. She was just one train on a sprawling, invisible network of rebellion, a ghost moving through a machine made of whispers, bombs, stars, rivers, and thousands of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The Underground Railroad wasn't a path. It was a web, and it didn't begin or end with Harriet. It stretched across more than 30 states, from the coastal plains of South Carolina to the pine forests of Michigan, from the cotton fields of Mississippi to the cold shores of Ontario, Canada, and at the heart of it all were people you've never heard of. Let's start with the station masters. These were the homeowners who hid fugitives. They ran stations in basements, attics, barns, and back rooms. They kept lamps burning in the window, sometimes as a signal, sometimes as a prayer. There were hundreds of them. Some were white Quakers, like Levi Coffin in Indiana, known as the president of the Underground Railroad. He and his wife Catherine helped over 3,000 people escape. Some were black farmers, like William Lambert in Detroit, who helped run one of the most sophisticated border crossing operations into Canada. Others were ministers, teachers, merchants, and midwives. And they didn't just offer shelter, they offered strategy. They tracked patrols, kept maps in their heads, coordinated with other safe houses via letters written in code or relayed by trusted couriers. Now, imagine the scale. You're escaping from Georgia. Your goal is Canada. That's over 1,000 miles. Through hostile territory, through towns where strangers mean trouble, through laws that say you can be arrested just for existing. You can't carry a map. You can't announce your name. You can't ask directions. But the system is already in place. Imagine Google Maps, but instead of traffic updates, it tells you which Quaker farmer won't turn you in tonight. That was the Underground Railroad. Routes weren't drawn, they were sung. Landmarks weren't signposted, they were remembered. It was a GPS made of gospel and gut instinct. Let's talk about conductors. Harriet was one, of course, but there were others, dozens, maybe hundreds. They didn't just hide people, they moved them, carried them, led them through back roads and secret trails. Some even disguised themselves as traveling salesmen or preachers to pass through towns unnoticed. They learned how to bribe ferry operators, how to spot friendly livery stables, how to hide fugitives under false floors in wagons, how to survive off the land when shelter wasn't safe. Every route had fallback options. If one safe house was compromised, another could be activated down the line. If someone was arrested, a message would ripple back to change the plan. And no one, not even the conductors, knew the full picture. That was by design. It was compartmentalized, just like modern intelligence agencies. You knew the person ahead of you, the person behind, and that was enough. Let's go deeper. According to PBS archives, some safe houses used coded quilts hung on clotheslines to send signals. A pattern of log cabins. The station is open. A star in the center. Go north. A zigzag border. Take the crooked path, not the straight one. Churches played a role too. Some had hidden compartments beneath the sanctuary. One church in Ohio was found, years later, to have a sub-basement where over 40 people were once hidden during a winter escape. Even spirituals, those seemingly innocent songs, were filled with hidden meaning. Follow the Drinking Gourd wasn't just about faith, it was a roadmap. The Drinking Gourd was the Big Dipper, which pointed north to freedom. The verses described rivers, turns, and landmarks to guide fugitives. When someone sang, "Wade in the water," it wasn't about baptism. It meant, walk through rivers to hide your scent from the dogs. You see, the Underground Railroad wasn't chaos. It was choreography, a synchronized movement of silence and speed, of faith and fire. Even cities became nodes in the system. New York had the Committee of Vigilance, helping fugitives blend in or get passage on ships to Canada. Boston had a network run by black abolitionists, like Lewis Hayden, who once threatened to blow up his own house, filled with gunpowder and refugees, if slave catchers came near. Philadelphia, that was William Still's ground zero. Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, all operated as northern gateways, final checkpoints before freedom across the border. And when Canada finally abolished slavery in 1834, it became the North Star in real time, a place where the Fugitive Slave Act couldn't reach. Over 30,000 formerly enslaved people made their way to Canada through the railroad, building entire communities that still exist today. Think about that, a secret operation, with no formal leaders, no budget, no technology, moving tens of thousands of people across a hostile continent. And it worked. But how? Because the railroad was built on something stronger than steel: trust. Radical trust between strangers, between a mother and the stranger who shelters her child, between a fugitive and the man who whispers a route in the night, between conductors who never met but risked their lives for the same goal. It wasn't perfect. Some were caught, some betrayed, Some died along the way, but the network held, and every successful escape made it stronger. Harriet Tubman once said, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. But that train only ran because of the countless others who kept the signals lit." The track's clear, the station's open. That's the real twist. The Underground Railroad wasn't about one woman. It was about a movement of thousands who never made headlines, who never wrote books, who never got statues. They were the ghost network, the invisible engineers of freedom. And now, with the power of history, of archives, of platforms like MetaFacts legends, we're bringing him back into the light. Because history isn't just made by the famous, it's made by the faithful. And their faith moved mountains. But not everyone celebrated this movement. In fact, as the railroad grew bolder, the response from the South grew more vicious. Bounties, bloodhounds, laws sharpened like blades. Freedom became more dangerous than ever. Which brings us to the next chapter. The price of resistance. Coming up next, Part 1.7 Wanted, Dead or Alive. The price of resistance. Stay with us. Part 1.7 Wanted, Dead or Alive. The price of resistance. The price of freedom was printed in ink. It was nailed to courthouse doors and tacked to tavern walls. It was stuffed into Southern newspapers and passed hand to hand by bounty hunters. $1,000. That was the going rate for runaway slave, captured and returned to their master in the 1850s. The equivalent of over $30 today. It didn't matter how old you were, how far you'd run, how many years you'd been gone. If you were black and someone claimed you as property, the law said you could be taken by force, by deception, by anyone willing to cash in. And business was booming after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Catching runaways became a government-endorsed industry. Every free state became a hunting ground. Every train station a potential trap. Every stranger a potential threat. Let's read directly from the law. All good citizens are hereby commanded to aid and assist in the prompt and efficient execution of this law, whenever their services may be required. In plain English, if you lived in the North and saw someone escaping slavery, you were legally obligated to help capture them. If you refused, you could be fined or imprisoned. Judges received $10 if they ruled someone was a fugitive, and any $5 if they ruled in favor of the accused. Even in free cities like Boston and Philadelphia, people were dragged from their homes and sent back south, based on nothing more than hearsay and paperwork. The message was clear: freedom had boundaries, and the system would enforce them violently. And then there were the bounty hunters. They called themselves slave catchers. Armed, ruthless, and often drunk, they roamed the countryside with dogs, guns, and ropes. Some were former soldiers, some were local sheriffs, others were just men chasing easy money. They didn't need warrants, they didn't need trials, they just needed to say, "That's my property," and the state would stand behind them. Entire towns in the North lived in fear, not of Southern armies, but of Southern laws backed by Northern courts. And in the middle of it all was her, Harriet Tubman. She wasn't just evading capture, she was taunting the system. 19 trips back into slave states, over 300 people freed, never caught, not once. The South couldn't take it. They labeled her a criminal, a thief, a conspirator, and they put a price on her head. $40,000. That's more than $1.5 million today. Think about that. A black woman, illiterate, 5 feet tall, epileptic, was one of the most wanted people in the United States. And she knew it. She changed her appearance constantly, carried a revolver, used code names, refused to sleep in the same place twice. She traveled by night, through forests and rivers, guided only by stars and instinct. She told passengers, "You'll be free or you'll be dead." And she meant it. Harriet didn't fear death, she feared failure. She feared being the reason someone didn't make it. So she planned every route like a military operation. And every time she crossed back into Maryland, she knew it could be the last. But she kept going, because the system didn't just want her stopped. It wanted her erased. And that's what bounty posters were really about. Not just capture, not just profit. They were warnings. To every runaway, you are never safe. To every conductor, you are expendable. To every citizen, help us hunt or become the hunted. But something happened that the South didn't expect. The harsher the law became, the more people resisted it. Entire northern towns began declaring nullification. They refused to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. They hid fugitives, obstructed arrests, even broke prisoners out of jail. In Christiana, Pennsylvania, a group of black and white residents confronted slave catchers with pitchforks and guns. A federal agent was killed. The town refused to apologize. In Oberlin, Ohio, townspeople stormed a courthouse to free a captured fugitive. The event made national headlines. No one served serious jail time. The railroad adapted too. Routes shifted farther north. Some conductors specialized in getting people not just to freedom, but to Canada, where US laws no longer applied. Others formed vigilante groups to protect communities. Some even turned the bounty system on its head, posting rewards for the capture of slave catchers. Resistance became infectious. It wasn't just Harriet, it was whole communities, whole counties. A shadow nation defined the United States government from within. And still, Harriet kept going back. Why? Why risk her life again and again? Why walk into danger with a target on her back and no guarantee of survival? Why not disappear into Canada and live in peace? That's the question, isn't it? It haunts every line of her story. Why did she keep going back? To understand that, you have to understand what was waiting for her. Chapter 2 begins not in fields or forests, but in the mind of a child. Struck in the head with a 2-pound weight, a girl who survived a coma, seizures, and slavery, and became something more, a legend. Chapter 1 ends here, but the story is only beginning. Because in Chapter 2, we go straight into the hell they ran from. The plantations, the violence, the tearing apart of families, the system that made people risk everything just for a chance to be human again. Stay with us. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, and we're just getting started. Hit that subscribe button if this history shocked you. If you believe these stories of courage and defiance need to be remembered, shared, and honored, subscribe, share this video, and tell us which story impacted you the most. Be sure to explore the description for even more fascinating resources.